Hi everyone, you all know who I am, Alex Wendt. I'm just here sort of as a more informal introduction because I've known Cosette the longest. I've actually known Cosette since the early 2000s when she was an undergraduate at the University of Chicago and then a master's student there. I moved to Ohio State in 2004 and Cosette then applied to the PhD program here. And in my letter, for her, which I wrote, I said that after 15 years at that time in my career of teaching at Yale, Dartmouth, and Chicago, that in terms of sheer intellectual candle power, or smarts, Cosette was the best undergraduate I'd ever had. She correspondingly declined our offer at Ohio State and went to Harvard to get her PhD and JD. But although I've had many really outstanding students at Ohio State since 2004, I think what I said back then is still true, that she is the best undergraduate student that I've ever had. So I just wanted to add that kind of personal note up front. Alex is going to do the kind of the substantive introduction, and I'll turn it over from here. So, okay.
Okay. Well, I don't want to keep you too long with introductions, so I'll just do a short and sweet introduction. Cosette Creamer is Assistant Professor of Political Science and the Benjamin E. Lippincott Chair in Political Economy at the University of Minnesota, where she's also an affiliated faculty member at the law school. The idea to invite her came from Alex, so thanks, Alex. And her visit is co-sponsored by the Mershon Director's Office, thanks, Rick, and the Globalization Workshop Series that I run along with Sarah Brooks. Cosette's research is at the intersection of international relations and international law, which isn't too surprising since she holds both a PhD in political science and a JD in international law from Harvard. Her real education came before that, when she was at the University of Chicago, where she got her undergraduate degree and her master's degree. The substantive focus of her research spans trade and economic law, international arbitration and dispute resolution, and international human rights law and agreements. The paper she's presenting today is titled Dilemmas of Delegation, the Politics of Authority in the World Trade Organization. Broadly speaking, this is a topic she's written a lot about, and in the presentation today, she'll explain to us how WTO dispute settlement panelists try to balance political and legal constraints. Turns out they are political actors. I'll leave it at that and turn it over to Cosette. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for these wonderful introductions. Oh, wow. Thank you for these wonderful introductions. I'm really delighted to be here, and I was delighted to receive the invitation to come present for you today one small part of a broader project that I have that I see as addressing a perennial issue for legal scholars and for political scientists, and that's whether courts take into account extrinsic considerations. So we often hear about this in the United States in the context of the US Supreme Court, whether or not the US Supreme Court is issuing decisions sort of based on or with its pulse on public opinion, and more recently, whether the US Supreme Court can or should take into account sociological gobbledygook when issuing rulings. I think at the international level, this issue is hugely salient, and we have intense debates about sort of the independence of third-party decision makers and about government control over institutions of global governance. So my talk today, Dilemmas of Delegation, the Politics of Authority in the World Trade Organization, examines how international judicial bodies and how the judicial bodies of the World Trade Organization in particular manage these tensions between judicial independence and government control, and examines how this then impacts the allocation of authority between domestic and international levels of governance. More specifically, my project, and this represents one case study of a broader book project that I have, my project asks when and why, or under what conditions, do we observe international judicial bodies providing greater accommodation to national governments, or deferring more to domestic regulatory or policy choices? So if you're familiar with the legal system of the European Union, the language that's often used there is that of a margin of appreciation. When is it that judges, within their rulings, are accommodating more or providing a greater range of movement or margin of appreciation to domestic institutions or state institutions? And my argument, really, really simply, is that we can identify the conditions under which international courts will accommodate national governments or signal greater accommodation to national governments by looking to their dual legal and political environments. So this isn't a new claim, right? That a little bit of law matters, that a little bit of politics matters. I see the contribution of my project really being to specify when and how each matters in a given institutional context, and to identify ways to evaluate how each matters. So more specifically, I argue that international courts, international judicial bodies, they pay attention. They're paying attention to they're paying attention to the degree of support, of institutional support that they enjoy in the eyes of their relevant stakeholders or constituents. And I call this sort of the underlying political capital. I argue that international judicial bodies are paying attention to signals of support or challenges to the exercise of their authority that are expressed by their relevant stakeholders. This underlying political capital or institutional support, I argue, that international judicial bodies are sensitive to shifts in it and pay attention to it, and under some conditions, responsive to increased criticism of their exercise of authority. But I argue further that the extent to which international judicial bodies are responsive to, are responding to increased challenges to their exercise of authority, to increased rhetorical challenges to their exercise of authority, is moderated in patterned ways by the legal constraints under which judges operate. And in most cases, this relates to existing relevant case law. So I'm going to flesh this argument out in much more detail during the course of this talk and in the context of the World Trade Organization. And in doing so, in order to support this argument, I'll draw on a range of both qualitative and quantitative evidence, including new codings of judicial rulings, the outcomes, how it is that these international judicial bodies are accommodating or signaling deference to national governments, as well as automated text analysis of government statements, new measures of legal constraints under which judges and adjudicators operate, and I supplement all this evidence with interviews I conducted with government representatives and court officials. And then I'll conclude today's talk by talking through some of the implications of my findings for the institutional design of international courts or judicial bodies more generally. Okay, so claims about court behavior more generally fall all along the spectrum, from challenges of judicial activism, judicial overreaching, to charges of biased courts pandering to their most powerful constituents. And I think it's fair to say that we can place existing explanations for international court behavior into roughly three camps. First, some argue that powerful countries, politically or economically influential countries, effectively control the courts that they create, whether directly or indirectly. So a number of IR scholars, for instance, argue that international institutions more generally, and international dispute settlement bodies, and courts more specifically, are effectively tools of the great powers, of great and powerful, economically powerful countries. Similarly, a number of legal scholars argue that international courts effectively conform their decisions to the preferences of the most dominant or influential constituents. And this is a slight simplification, but the takeaway point within this approach to explaining international court behavior is that we can't really talk about international courts exercising independent decision-making authority in any real true or meaningful sense. So a more nuanced version of this state control argument, that states are basically creating these international institutions, and effectively the most powerful countries or members of these institutions control them. A more nuanced version of the state control argument draws from a principal-agent approach that was developed at the domestic level and applies this to explaining when and how states create and delegate authority to international institutions. And the argument here goes that states, the principals in this principal-agent relationship, are creating these courts, the agents, and delegating to them certain decision-making authority. But in doing so, they're worried about overreaching and judicial expansionism, and so create when they design these institutions, they create formal or structural mechanisms to control their behavior, to control their decision-making behavior. This takes the form, for example, of powers of appointment of the judges, control over the purse strings of an institution or the budget, and recontracting more generally. But there's a growing body of evidence that suggests that many of these formal and structural mechanisms of control are incredibly difficult for states collectively to actually employ in practice. That it's incredibly hard for states to use these mechanisms of control to influence the decisions made by these institutions via, for example, judicial appointments or restrictions of budgets. Moreover, when states do attempt to use them, they oftentimes end up being ineffective at impacting sort of the long-term decision-making behavior of these institutions. In other words, states don't have, at all points in time, perfect control over the institutions that they're creating and to whom or to which they're delegating authority. So a third approach to explaining international court behavior argues that we can't really think about these institutions, these courts, as agents of the principal states, but rather as trustees, right, engaged in a fiduciary relationship with the governments and the states that created them. Courts as trustees, this approach argues, sit relatively far removed from the day-to-day politics of the underlying institution and exercise, in a true and relatively meaningful sense, independent judicial or legal decision-making authority. Yet, as any scholar of judicial politics, and judicial politics within the domestic level in particular knows, judges are politically savvy actors. They're savvy and strategic actors that sometimes do, and often do, take into account extrinsic considerations and have their own personal incentives. In other words, international adjudicators, right, cannot be thought of as purely independent decision-making actors. So we need something a little bit more to explain in a given institutional context, in a given case, how this decision-making authority is going to be exercised, and what independence looks like, and what sort of what political constraints look like. Enter my argument. So I argue that governments face this dilemma of delegation, right? They've created these international courts, and they want to accrue all the benefits that they can reap, right, from this independent decision-making body, resolving disputes, issuing rulings. But at the same time, right, they're still concerned about judicial overreaching, the expansion of the mandate or of authority by this international body. And because of the fact that the formal or structural mechanisms of control that they might have designed initially into the international institution are ineffective or difficult to employ in practice, governments instead rely on more diffuse or informal mechanisms to try to shape the decision-making behavior of international courts. So I argue that governments rely on rhetorical signals or communicative pressures to signal to courts, to signal to the adjudicators, the judges, right, when they think that this institution, this judicial body is overstepping its boundaries, to challenge the exercise of authority in certain cases, but also to signal sort of more sort of diffuse political support for the exercise of authority by these international courts. So in other words, governments are basically using communicative pressures to send signals to these judges, right, about when these judges are making their decisions right or in line with the membership's preferences and when they're not. And I call these sort of communicative pressures or diffuse rhetorical signals of support the political capital of an international court. So we can think of political capital of an international court in relation to sort of its institutional legitimacy. At a given moment in time, how much institutional or political support is that judicial body enjoying in the eyes of its relevant stakeholders? But I argue that international judges, adjudicators, they're sensitive to shifts in their political capital. When their primary stakeholders or constituents are relatively more critical, they're paying attention to that increased criticism, those increases and challenges to their exercise of authority. But I argue that they're not always responsive in their rulings, in their behavior, to shifts in their underlying political capital. That they're paying attention, but that the extent to which they're responsive to, and that they respond to within their rulings, increased criticism or challenges to their authority, is moderated in identifiable and patterned ways by the legal constraints under which judges operate, which relates in most cases to the existing jurisprudence or case law on a given issue. So I'm going to flesh this argument out in more detail in the context of the World Trade Organization. But before doing so, I need to give you a little bit of institutional context or background of this body. So as many of you know, the World Trade Organization, the successor to the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade, was created in 1995 by a multilateral treaty. And at that point in time, it created what is often seen as one of the most highly judicialized, independent, and strongest international adjudicative bodies that exists today. And that's the dispute settlement mechanism of the WTO. And especially in contrast to the much more politicized dispute panels that existed under the GATT, the WTO is often held up as one of the strongest international judicial bodies within the international system, especially with respect to its quote-unquote indirect enforcement powers. So how does dispute settlement in the World Trade Organization work? Well, the WTO establishes a number of rules, laws, standards that governments have to implement and abide by when it comes to formulating their trade policies. If one country thinks that another country has enacted a trade policy or regulation that in some way violates or breaches WTO law, it can initiate a dispute with that country within the WTO. So for instance, this was about 6 years ago, Indonesia initiated a dispute against the United States in the World Trade Organization. So the United States has passed challenging a provision within the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act. So this was a statute, a piece of law, a piece of legislation that went through Congress that was enacted largely in response to a nationwide anti-youth smoking campaign and really balanced a number of competing domestic political interests within the United States. And what this law did, among other things, was prohibit the import, manufacture, and sale of clove cigarettes. So before 2009, you could actually get clove cigarettes in the United States and bring them in. At that point in time, they were completely prohibited from being imported, manufactured, or sold in the United States. And crucially, though, this Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act made an exception for menthol cigarettes. So it said flavored cigarettes were bad, so we're prohibiting clove cigarettes because this really attracts teens to smoking, but we'll make an exception for menthol cigarettes, hint, hint, because Philip Morris has incredibly strong lobbying power within the US, and Philip Morris produces and manufactures a large quantity and sells a large quantity of menthol cigarettes. At this point in time, the vast majority, nearly all of the clove cigarettes that were sold in the United States were imported from Indonesia, and actually represented hundreds of millions of dollars of annual revenue for that Southeast Asian nation. So Indonesia challenged these provisions within this U.S. piece of legislation, arguing that this was discriminatory, this violated WTO rules, and was trade discriminatory against Indonesia. So within the dispute settlement system of the WTO, countries first have to engage in bilateral private negotiations to try to resolve this dispute. And if they can't after a certain amount of time, one or both of the parties to the dispute can request the establishment of what's called a dispute panel. So for our purposes, we can kind of think of dispute panels as courts of first instance. But they're ad hoc bodies. It's a panel of 3 individuals, 3 panelists, who are appointed by the parties to adjudicate and resolve this dispute, to hear evidence about whether or not this piece of legislation violated WTO obligations, and to make a ruling. These panelists, these 3 individuals, they're appointed ad hoc for that dispute only, and they oftentimes hold additional jobs. They have full-time jobs in addition to acting as panelists. The vast majority of these panelists actually work either for their government's trade ministries back home or are their government's representatives within the WTO. So they oftentimes sit in Geneva on the political bodies of the WTO representing their home government, but are asked for the specific dispute to help adjudicate and resolve it. Importantly, the panelists have to be either appointed, agreed upon by both parties, so both parties have to agree which 3 panelists to appoint. And if they can't agree or they otherwise request it, they can ask the Director General of the World Trade Organization, basically a civil sort of servant official of the World Trade Organization, to do the appointment. And actually the vast majority of panels that have been established have been created and appointed by the Director General of the WTO. So the dispute panel, when it's hearing this evidence, it's hearing pleadings from both parties, and it's sort of issuing a ruling and writing a ruling, it's assisted in its task by what's called the Legal Secretariat of the Legal Affairs Division, or the Legal Secretariat of the WTO. And I'll say a bit more about them in a second. So after the ruling comes down, one or both parties can appeal this decision to the Court of Second Instance within the WTO, what's called the appellate body of the WTO. And this is a permanent international adjudicative body that sits in Geneva. And it is sort of the court of last resort, so to speak, within the WTO. The vast majority of cases are now actually appealed to the appellate body, but not every single case necessarily is. So the appellate body can only hear appeals on issues of law. So it only reviews legal decisions that were made by the panel, and then issues its own ruling, which is the final ruling adjudicating the dispute. So it's important to note that within the World Trade Organization, there's no formal rule of binding precedent. It's called stare decisis in domestic legal systems. So any decision or ruling that is made by the appellate body is really only binding on that case. Panels don't necessarily have to follow legal rulings or decisions made by the appellate body in prior cases. But there's considerable evidence and scholarship out there that suggests that a form of de facto precedent exists. That even though that as a matter of law, panels in the appellate body don't have to pay attention to their past decisions, we can see sort of for reasons of consistency and predictability, these judges are actually in practice following previous case law. So as I mentioned, the dispute panel, when it's sort of hearing all this evidence and hearing all these oral arguments, it's assisted in its task by members of the Legal Affairs Secretariat. So these are civil servant officials, oftentimes career officials who have been within the WTO and the Secretariat of the WTO for a considerable period of time. And their job is to basically do a lot of the legal research and writing. So I've actually served in this role for war crimes tribunals, where you do all the legal research for the panelists, for the judges, and you write the initial drafts of the rulings that are being issued. Simultaneously, though, the Legal Affairs Secretariat is also helping. It's there to serve the member states, the member governments of the WTO. So within the WTO, there's a political body called the Dispute Settlement Body. This is distinct from the Dispute Settlement Mechanism. The DSM is like the judicial bodies. The Dispute Settlement Body is the political body. It's the political body of the WTO where every single government representative has a seat. It meets once a month. And its purpose is to basically oversee the dispute settlement system within the WTO. So government representatives show up every month, and they make statements about sort of establishing panels, about the rulings that panels or the appellate body have put down, about sort of the implementation or compliance of these judgments by governments. So they meet once, sometimes twice a month to do this. And all of these statements governments are making are on the record within the political body of the dispute settlement body. And the Legal Affairs Secretariat is there as well, right? Officials from the Legal Affairs Secretariat are there to help answer questions that member governments may have about the dispute settlement system, about a matter of WTO law, and they're actually the ones sitting in this room transcribing the statements made and the meeting minutes. And this goes into this becomes the official record of the dispute settlement body. So in this way, the Legal Affairs Secretariat plays an incredibly important role in my argument in sort of collecting, aggregating, and transmitting to the dispute panelists, right, everything that's being said by the member governments on the record about the exercise of authority by the dispute settlement mechanism. So given this institutional context, my talk today focuses on the court of first instance, these dispute panels. Given this institutional context, I ask, why is it that sometimes we see these dispute panels really providing much greater deference to domestic trade policy choices? Why sometimes are they providing much greater accommodation and flexibility, allowing domestic institutions much wider room or latitude to decide how to implement WTO obligations? And why at other times do they defer little to domestic regulatory or trade policy choices? So I argue that, we need to look to the DSB, that governments within the WTO, that government representatives within the WTO are using the statements that they're making on the record within the dispute settlement body to actually send signals to the dispute settlement mechanism, to the adjudicative bodies of the World Trade Organization. They're signaling satisfaction with decisions that the DSM has made. They're signaling dissatisfaction or criticism of judicial overreaching when they think the appellate body or the dispute panels have stepped outside the bounds of their authority. And they're doing all of this on the record, formally, publicly, right, within the dispute settlement body. And this step in my argument was supported by a number of interviews that I conducted with government representatives who sit in the WTO. So these are the government delegates, oftentimes ambassadors, who are the ones standing up in front of the dispute settlement body and making statements about a ruling that the panel issued, or a ruling that the appellate body issued, or the acceptance, for example, of amicus curiae briefs by the appellate body or panels. One representative from a relatively large country that has been engaged in a number of disputes said that despite what the black letter lawyers think, there's a political organization here. Shocker. The World Trade Organization is a political organization. The dispute settlement mechanism of the WTO is a political organization. Member control is already happening in and through dispute settlement body meetings, through the statements that governments are making. So governments are using these statements to send signals to various audiences, and one of those audiences is the adjudicators, the judges of the WTO. Another government representative, slightly smaller country, stated that these statements are a way to send to them being the panelists, the appellate body members, and the secretariat officials who are assisting the panelists, to send to them a concrete message. And the representative continued, that's the right way, by the way. So it's actually the right way to send to them a concrete message through these public statements, not to go ex parte, so not to sort of sneakily go behind the backs of all the other government representatives and try to more indirectly influence or persuade these judges. So governments are using these statements to signal satisfaction and dissatisfaction about the exercise of judicial authority within the dispute settlement body. But second, panelists and secretariat officials in particular, they're paying attention to these signals. Right? These signals are actually reaching some of their intended audiences. And this step in my argument was also supported by interviews that I conducted with former panelists and WTO secretariat officials. One secretariat official who's actually been there since and before the inception of the WTO stated that there is a message. There's a message that's being sent by these statements. And depending on how important or sensitive the issue is, so what the statement is about really, and whether it's seen as just sort of complaining, the DSM, the dispute settlement mechanism, the panels and the appellate body will take it into account. Another secretariat official said that the secretariat officials, they're sitting in the room, right? They're actually sitting in the room while these statements are being made. The panelists might not be, the appellate body members might not be, but the officials who are helping these adjudicators, they're sitting there in the room. So the brain by necessity has to be taking into account these statements, or at least registering them. And panelists and appellate body members are listening, this official continued. So I argue that governments are sending these statements, that panelists and secretariat officials are paying attention to them, but that as strategic political actors, panelists are seeking to maximize their political capital. So sort of the supportive statements and signals that are being sent within the DSB. They're trying to increase their overall level of institutional support that they enjoy among the WTO membership. That is, they're trying to maximize their political capital to the extent possible. This overall level of support expressed by governments within the DSB. But they're also strategic legal actors, right? These are oftentimes trade lawyers or trade officials who have reputations to uphold, and they don't want to be smacked down by the appellate body, right? They don't want to have their rulings reversed. They don't want to sort of be chastised or chided by the appellate body for misinterpreting WTO law. So also seek to avoid having that happen. And in doing so, pay attention to appellate body case law. So you might think, even if this is not what's motivating panelists, these panelists have full-time jobs, why do they even care about sort of the overall level of support that the WTO membership is expressing? Even if this is not what independently motivates them, the Secretariat officials provide a very low-cost way for them to engage in this risk-averse behavior. The Secretariat officials, for their part, really, especially in the Legal Affairs Division, really see themselves as playing a dual role. They're trying to secure compliance. They want government support for the institution and the dispute settlement mechanism as a whole, because they want governments to then go home if they lose and implement those rulings. This increases the strength of the WTO as a whole. And these Legal Affairs Secretariat officials have incredibly strongly internalized role conceptions about the position that they're supposed to play vis-a-vis the member governments. At the same time, though, they do see the dispute settlement mechanism as the crown and the jewel of the jewel and the crown of the WTO, right? They see this really as a way to ensure consistency and predictability, and legal predictability in particular, and so really want to ensure that any ruling that's being issued, right, conforms more generally to the jurisprudence that the WTO has established over time. So I argue more generally then that if this is the case, if panels are paying and Secretariat officials are paying attention to shifts in their underlying political capital, we can expect them to try to maximize it to the extent possible within the legal constraints, the case law jurisprudence under which they're operating. So this then leads to sort of two observable implications, I guess, of my argument, or what we should expect to see if this is the case. So first, if panels are sensitive and responsive to increased challenges to their exercise of authority, to increased criticism to these signals, as their political capital declines, right, as governments are expressing more and more dissatisfaction with how they're resolving disputes, we should expect to see panels within their rulings providing greater accommodation to the defendant government. That is, signaling to the member states, okay, we're taking into account your concerns about judicial overreaching. We're exercising some judicial restraint here, where we're providing domestic governments with more flexibility and more accommodation to implement WTO rules as they see fit. And the idea is that they're signaling to member governments, okay, we're taking into account your concerns, and that sort of assuage some of these worries that you might have about judicial activism. So to capture this idea of accommodation, right, or providing greater flexibility or deference to governments, I collected and coded all panel reports, 187 panel reports or rulings. These are the rulings that the dispute panels issued between 1996 and 2013. So each of these rulings makes a number of decisions, right? It's not you win or lose, right? You win on some counts. There's some provisions, you lose on other counts. There's some aspects of your trade policy or your anti-dumping investigation that you have to change. There are other aspects that are fine and you can keep in place. And so each ruling consists of a number of discrete findings. And so I coded these findings for each ruling, for whether or not each finding either sort of provided greater deference to the defendant government or didn't. So whether they won or lost on a specific issue. So this then led to what I call a panel validation score, which is the proportion of the number of discrete findings made within a given ruling, within which the panel said, okay, you're good. You don't have to change your trade regulation. So this is a continuous variable that ranges from 0 to 1. And actually the vast majority of cases, at this point in time, over 75% of the cases are not slam dunk cases. Right? Over 75% of the cases, the defendant has lost on some aspects and has won on some aspects. So the vast majority of these are mixed rulings and fall somewhere in between the 0-1 on the panel validation score. So for example, just to sort of concretize this a little bit more, in the case that we were talking about before, the US and Indonesia with respect to clove cigarettes, the panel made 9 discrete findings in total, and 2 of these are the most important ones. So in one finding, the WTO panel found that this Tobacco Control Act, this Family, Smoking and Planning Act, violated WTO rules because it accorded to imported clove cigarettes treatment less favorable. It was discriminating against clove cigarettes in relation to the treatment that it afforded menthol cigarettes. So in this case, it was basically like, okay, clove cigarettes prohibit the sale and manufacture of these, but menthol cigarettes are okay. And this was trade discriminatory, the panel found. And so it was in breach of the U.S.'s obligations under the TBT agreement. But it also found that, in another discrete finding, that it wasn't more trade restrictive or trade discriminatory than necessary to fulfill the legitimate objective of reducing smoking. So it actually upheld the underlying objective of the law and said, okay, this is fine. This conforms to your WTO obligations. This is a completely legitimate objective to engage in trade discriminatory behavior. But if you're going to discriminate against clove cigarettes, you also have to discriminate against menthol cigarettes. And this particular finding was widely seen as really providing greater deference to domestic governments in enacting sort of regulatory policies to ensure the health and safety of their citizens. So in this case, out of 9 total findings, there were a number of breach findings, a number of non-breach findings, and in this instance led to a panel validation score of a little bit over 0.5. So to capture the idea of political capital, or the underlying sort of institutional or political support enjoyed by the judicial bodies, I collected all statements made by government representatives on the record in the DSB between 1995 and 2013. And then I employed a form of automated non-parametric content analysis to basically classify these statements into 4 distinct categories. Whether or not the statement was critical of the exercise of authority by the WTO's judicial bodies, whether it was supportive of that exercise of authority, whether it was neutral, right? It didn't express either criticism or support for how the WTO's judicial bodies had reached a decision or exercised its authority. And then lastly, there are a number of statements that aren't about the judicial bodies at all, that are about other governments not implementing their rulings, that are about sort of the establishment of panels. And so I coded those statements out so that they didn't get mixed up with the estimates of the percentage of statements made in a given month, in a given year, that are critical of the exercise of authority or that are supportive of it. And this figure plots over time the percentage or the proportion of all DSB statements made that are supportive, that's the dotted line, or that are critical of the exercise of authority. And the main takeaway point here is that this varies considerably. It fluctuates considerably over time. The amount of criticism or the amount of support that's expressed by WTO member governments. So there's variation over time, and that the way that the WTO member governments are actually engaging with the dispute settlement system changed pretty significantly in 2005. And we can talk in Q&A about why this might be. My suspicion is that it has to do with a lot of countries that aren't, that sort of a lot of developing countries in particular is increasing frustration with the inability of the dispute settlement mechanism to actually address sort of systemic disparities between developing and developed countries in the WTO, but I'd be interested in sort of hearing your thoughts on this as well. Yeah, sure.
So not every statement is coded as either critical or supportive?
So this measure is an estimate of, in a given half year, the percent of all statements that's made in the DSB that are critical and that are supportive. So we can talk more about sort of the coding of this. The way that what I use to classify these statements, the automated non-parametric form of content analysis, is category. So it's not classifying, it's not individual statement classification.
Right.
It's classifying, it's using a readme package basically by Hopkins and King that
So if
provides a
they're both
proportion.
low, it just means that the statements were sort of less opinionated
Yep.
with respect to the
Yeah.
DSM. Okay.
Yeah, and we can talk a little bit about what that means. I mean, my sense, just from sort of like a psychological perspective, is you're much less likely to say something that's like praiseworthy, right? If you're just generally happy with the way things are. And you're much more likely, which is why I pay much more attention to the critical statements, you're much more likely to voice an opinion and put it on the record if you're unhappy or dissatisfied with the way something's going. But in these years in particular, there just weren't a lot of panel rulings or appellate body rulings that were being adopted. So there was just less for them to talk about with respect to the judicial bodies in the WTO. So in other words, I would expect to see as criticism increases, as that solid line increases in a given year, that following this, the panel should be issuing or providing greater deference or accommodation within their rulings. But furthermore, I argue that when the panels are ruling on an issue that the appellate body has, for which there's a lot of appellate body case law, so issues that are frequently litigated or brought before the dispute settlement mechanism within the WTO, in these cases, the Secretariat officials are pushing the panelists to take their cues from the appellate body and the appellate body case law and not from the member governments, to pay much less attention to shifts in their underlying political support. And in these instances then, I would argue that these legal constraints are actually will moderate or will dampen down the influence of political capital, of signals of dissatisfaction on panels' judicial decision-making. So to capture this idea of legal constraints, and we can talk more in Q&A about this as well, I created for every ruling that was issued what's called an appellate body case law score. And this basically captures sort of both the scope and the density of each appellate body case law. So how much case law there is that has accumulated around a specific provision or WTO rule that's being litigated in a given dispute. So it's not just a count of how many sort of appellate body rulings exist up to that point. It's very sort of issue and provision specific around whatever is being litigated and adjudicated within a given dispute. And so within sort of standard to sort of test whether this is the case, whether or not panels are providing greater accommodation or deferring more, right, to national government decisions when they're facing much greater criticism among the membership as a whole. Within standard OLS regressions, I include measures of sort of the estimates of political capital, and I focus on criticism because, as I was saying before, I think intuitively we only express sort of criticism, we only sort of make a statement about something when we're unhappy with it, but also the Secretariat officials that I spoke with really are they're paying much more attention to these incredibly critical statements. So I think this is what's doing a lot of the driving work here. So in standard OLS regression models, I include sort of estimates of the proportion of statements that are critical 6 years prior to a panel ruling. I include measures of the appellate body case law score, so the legal constraints under which I think panels are operating. And I interact these because, as I argued, I think sort of the appellate body case law, that jurisprudence is moderating the extent to which panels and Secretariat officials are being responsive to political criticism. But I also include, I should also say, within these models, I also include estimates of supportive statements as well, and that doesn't change my findings. And then I include sort of a battery of quote-unquote control variables that capture a lot of the factors that scholars who study trade disputes and international judicial decision-making more generally tend to influence court behavior. So whether or not, for example, the US or the EU, a powerful country that's dragged before the WTO a lot, whether they were the defendant, the economic size of the complainant, so how wealthy the country bringing the dispute is, a number of variables that capture sort of distinct aspects of some of the trade measures or policies being challenged. So whether it's a piece of legislation, a statute, whether it was an executive regulation, whether what was being challenged was the way in which, for example, the U.S. conducted an anti-dumping investigation, which is oftentimes undertaken by an administrative agency domestically. I also included variables to control for politically sensitive issue areas, so politically sensitive agreements that deal with, for example, agriculture or textiles. Historically, this has been incredibly sensitive within the World Trade Organization negotiations. And then a number of characteristics or factors that sort of capture characteristics of the judges themselves. So whether these are panelists that are repeat panelists who've been reappointed to panels numerous times, whether they are concurrently delegates for their own home governments within the WTO, and thus might be more attuned, right, to sort of political considerations within the organization. And I find that sort of criticism is consistently and positively associated with higher validation scores. So in other words, panels really do seem to be providing governments with greater accommodation when the membership as a whole is relatively more critical. So this marginal effects plot displays the relationship between criticism and a report's validation score. So that's the relationship between criticism and a report's validation score. So as criticism increases, we should expect to see higher validation scores on the y-axis along different levels of appellate body case law against on the x-axis. And it shows that the influence, right, the extent to which panels are providing greater accommodation within their rulings, the influence of criticism on accommodation is declining. It's decreasing as appellate body case law, as that jurisprudence is accumulating. So the impact of criticism on validation, though, is still statistically significant when the appellate body case law is at 3, which actually this represents still 75% of the rulings that have been issued by the panels up until 2013. So the impact of criticism on validation is significant for lower levels of appellate body case law, but as case law accumulates, right, the impact of shifts in the dispute settlement mechanisms underlying political capital, the sort of influence of that on their rulings is decreasing. This finding suggests that as appellate jurisprudence begins and will continue to accumulate, particularly around frequently litigated provisions having to do with national treatment under the GATT or anti-dumping investigations, the panels are beginning to pay much less attention to negative shifts in their political capital when they're issuing their rulings. So I began this talk by asking when or under what conditions do we see WTO panels signaling greater accommodation, greater deference, greater judicial restraint to national governments within the WTO. I then drew on a range of evidence to try to convince you that we can specify when by looking to shifts in the political capital of the WTO's dispute settlement mechanism, specifically in the form of increased criticism or expressions of dissatisfaction with the way in which the judicial bodies are exercising their authority, but that the panel's responsiveness to these changes in their political capital to increase dissatisfaction is moderated in important ways by existing case law. So these findings suggest a number of things. First, that panels, dispute panels in particular, are effectively using their rulings on issues that have fewer appellate body case law, less appellate body case law, to provide governments with greater flexibility through greater accommodation. And in this way, I suggest that panels are actually helping to address a primary institutional design concern that governments have, that scholars have. How do we balance within these international institutions greater legalism, greater predictability, with the continued adaptability and flexibility of the regime? And I think that panels are effectively trying to achieve this balance through their rulings and through their responsiveness to increased dissatisfaction among the WTO membership. However, the moderating effect of legal constraints, right, as the influence of political capital declines as appellate body case law accumulates, suggests that for some of the most litigated provisions, anti-dumping investigations, for example, the DSM is actually providing greater predictability at the expense of long-term adaptability or flexibility. So this might not be problematic from a normative position. This might not be problematic if the balance achieved, right, continues to be satisfactory for member states or for the membership as a whole. But if not, right, we may at least sort of putting on my cap of a lawyer and an institutional designer, we may need to think about ways to actually design a more formal feedback mechanism within the WTO. And it also suggests that as appellate jurisprudence begins to accumulate over time, panels are going to become less responsive overall to the expressed views of members. A second, I think, implication of my findings is that we need to pay much more attention to the design of the secretariat or the registries within these international judicial bodies. So the picture that I painted today about the WTO secretariat was pretty rosy, right? It's playing this dual role, managing sort of the political constraints under which these judges are operating while still ensuring legal consistency and predictability. But I think in a number of other international judicial bodies, the role that the legal secretariat or the registry plays is a much more nefarious and gatekeeping one that can actually undermine the legitimacy and support for an international judicial body overall. So I think the role of the Secretariat and the role that registries play, these sort of civil service servant officials within these organizations, is not paid very much attention to within international relations scholarship, and I think it's an area that's sort of ripe for further research. So then the big picture question, right? Does all of this matter, right? I'm just basically explaining the behavior of judges. Does this actually impact anything domestically when it comes to trade law or policy? And I suggest that it does. In other research, I found that sort of this little bit of sugar that panels and sometimes the appellate body are providing, this little bit of deference or accommodation, actually matters when it comes time for governments to go home and change or reform their trade laws or policies to implement the WTO rulings. That if a panel or an appellate body is providing greater accommodation, right, upholding more aspects of a trade regulation, there's a greater probability that the dispute will be settled, and that it will be settled much quicker, that the ruling will actually be implemented much quicker than when less accommodation or less deference is provided. And I'm happy to talk about this research as well, but I find that all of this is actually conditional on it needing to go through the legislature. So this accommodation, right, this greater deference, actually only matters when the executive branch can go home and stand before sort of political opposition potentially within the legislature and say, look, we won on these aspects of this dispute, right? But we might have to reform this little part of this domestic law or statute, but we won on this aspect. And that this actually helps them overcome, in some instances, domestic political opposition to trade reform. So on that note, I will conclude, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Well, why don't you just call on people when hands go up?
Sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. It's really interesting. I have two questions. The first one is about...
Yeah, I wanted to introduce you.
Yeah, sorry.
I'm Jan Piskala. I'm an assistant professor here in the department. My first question is about these panelists. I still don't have a good understanding, that's just my lack of knowledge, of like who these people really are and how do they think of themselves. If they're just kind of emissaries of the country that tries to appoint them, then I don't understand why they would care about the political capital of the institution per se. And since they're convened in an ad hoc manner, I don't know how they could maybe develop that.
Mm-hmm.
I guess that the argument would make sense if they do have the self-understanding of representing the WTO and the institution as a whole. So I would be more convinced maybe if you could show us results that looks at the repeat members, if the effects are stronger there. I think that would be interesting. If the people that are always on these panels have this kind of different self-understanding and then act in that way. My second question is about how these signals are informative. Like, so if the criticism is mostly driven by the criticism of the defendant that's trying to sway the opinion of the panel, then if that's working, and I don't understand why not everybody would always criticize all the time to sway the opinion of the panel. Like in equilibrium, I don't see how either side wouldn't all the time be critical to sway the court. So if that's the case, then as a panelist, I wouldn't know to distinguish like an informative signal from a just cheap talk signal.
Yeah.
Now, if it's just the general criticism of the DSM as a full procedure that we measure here, again, okay, that's maybe then saying that the panel should step back and not mess with individual countries. But then wouldn't that piss off the country that sues in the first place? They would lose kind of belief in the political capital of the institution because none of their, I mean, as you said earlier, like not all these developing countries that complain never get a favorable ruling, really in the end. And then you lose political capital as an institution too, just off the countries that don't matter as much maybe. But I wanted to hear more whether this is a criticism by the overall institution or of the kind of the defending country, and how that is really informative to the panel.
Right. Yeah. Great. Should I collect some or should I?
Well, that was still quite a bit.
Sorry.
All right. So I'll start with the first question with respect to panelists. So I actually was expecting to find an effect with sort of the repeat panelist variable, but I didn't. And I don't think that's problematic for my argument for a number of reasons. So first of all, I don't think that the motivations or what's driving the behavior of individual panelists is actually uniform or homogeneous across all panelists. I think panelists vary in their motivations, whether they care or not. And then we'll talk about why I don't think that's also problematic with respect to the Legal Affairs Secretariat. But for a number of these individual panelists, and a number that I've spoken with, they are motivated by repeat appointments. They want to actually be, it's flattering and it's good for their careers and their professional reputations if they're asked back to sit on these panels. It heightens their prestige, so to speak, their legal reputation within the trade law world if they're asked back. And so they care a little bit about sort of managing or balancing sort of membership concern, but also sort of the appearance of effectively issuing decisions that are sort of sticking to the letter of the law, so to speak. And a number of these panelists are, as I said before, a number of them either just sort of finished a post representing their government as a WTO delegate, or they're actually sitting there, in sort of the TRIPS Council or another political body of the WTO as their government's representative. And the culture of the WTO, organizational culture of the WTO, and among sort of the delegates, we can talk about whether that applies to the USTR or not, probably not, but the organizational culture among a number of these delegates in the WTO is incredibly strong. They all have lunch together, they all know each other, and so if sort of in the morning I have to sit here on a panel, right, and hear arguments that you're making, representing your country, and then in the afternoon sort of we're sitting next to each other in a political body, sort of a sense of sort of camaraderie or sort of organizational mission begins to develop among the representatives themselves. And for a lot of these government delegates, they've been there, they've been appointed, right, to represent their governments to the WTO for an incredibly long period of time. And so they're invested personally, reputationally, professionally, they're invested in the strength and success of the WTO as a whole, and at least because of the fact that sort of WTO trade negotiations have largely stalled, a lot of that strength and success now is seen as resting on the effectiveness of the dispute settlement mechanism. So there's buy-in for a number of these WTO government representatives. But then there are those, to be sure, there are those panelists who don't care, right? They're either academics or they're sort of within their trade ministries back home and they're just invited or appointed to sit on this panel this one time. And they oftentimes don't do any legal research. They're not paying attention. There was one, he's actually now in the legal affairs, or he's now a deputy undersecretary in the WTO, and he's been a panelist on a number of cases. So there are instances where, the panelists are asking questions to the parties, and they clearly have no idea what these questions even mean. Right? It's clear that the legal affairs secretary is doing the research for them, writing these questions. And I argue that for those panelists, yeah, they don't care. They don't care about the political capital of the DSM. They don't really sort of care about the overall level of support or dissatisfaction that it enjoys. But in those instances, effectively they can engage in lazy, risk-averse behavior by just doing what the legal affairs secretary tells them to do. So I emphasized it a little bit, but I actually think that the legal affairs secretary is doing a lot of the work that's driving the panel responsiveness to shifts in political capital. I probably should have emphasized that a little bit more, but I don't think that's always the case. There are some panelists who say, no, we want to take sort of ownership of this decision, and so they pay much less attention to what the secretariat officials are saying. But I was expecting repeat panelist effects, and I was a little bit disappointed when I didn't find them. So how are these signals informative? So the way that, I was a little bit worried about this when I started on this task, right, of coding these as sort of measures of criticism or support, because it's pushback that I get a lot. Isn't this just like the losing parties complaining and the winning parties, keeping quiet or saying, yay, they did a good job because we won? So I should say, first of all, that the statements that are being used to construct these measures are statements that are made prior to a ruling is issued. So they're not actually about a particular dispute. They're about disputes that have already been resolved, other disputes, right? Or about sort of procedural aspects of how these disputes are being run more generally. And so I was actually surprised to find, yes, you have sort of, you're complaining by the losing party sometimes, and you're, yay, we won by the winning party. But you actually see that a lot less than I was expecting, right? So governments, they are criticizing specific findings of the panels that the appellate body are making, but they're also making statements, and I have a couple examples if you'd like to see them. They're also making statements about sort of the overall exercise of authority, whether sort of as a whole over a range of rulings, the appellate body or panels are starting to sort of expand the boundaries of their mandate, whether they're engaging in judicial activism or overreaching, whether or not they're providing, for instance, and this is where the Secretariat pays the most attention, whether or not they're providing sort of procedural due process rights. right? Whether or not they're providing equality of arms between the parties, whether or not whether or not they should be taking into account amicus curiae. So, for example, NGOs or other interested third parties can submit these briefs, these arguments, and whether or not doing so oversteps the boundaries of their exercise of authority that the membership as a whole sees. So, to be sure, there are a few of these statements that are sort of just complaining by the losing party that's critical. But even those who, the European Union is probably a good example of this. The EU very rarely, if ever, even when it loses a dispute, issues a completely critical statement. Right? I might say, okay, we disagree with this one aspect of the panel appellate body ruling, but in general, sort of was well-reasoned opinion, right? And so actually expresses support for how it's exercising this authority more generally. Because the EU knows that, this one dispute, it's on the defendant's side, right? But the next dispute, it's going to be the complainant. And so I think there are ways that countries could rig the system, just always complain when they want some greater accommodation, but at least we haven't observed that descriptively within the statements themselves over time. Maybe I shouldn't present that findings, so they don't use these statements in that way. But I hope that answered your questions. Yeah.
John Mueller from Mershon. I don't know very much about this whole field, but from your description, it sounds like it actually works pretty well, the WTO. The general goal is to advance international trade and works in a real-world environment with national egos, individual egos, and members, some of whom are extremely powerful economically and others are extremely weak economically. So I wonder if you would agree that it basically works pretty well, and also what you would do to change it to make it work better. Would you have any recommendations?
So this is where I think we need to distinguish the WTO as a whole from the dispute settlement mechanism. So I think the WTO as a whole is actually facing, as an organization, is facing a pretty severe crisis right now, especially with trade negotiations, right, and the further expansion of trade agreements being stalled, largely because of this developed country dynamic within the World Trade Organization, and the way in which the WTO really hasn't addressed systemic disparities between developing and developed countries. So effectively, the trade negotiations to create new trade agreements or trade rules have been stalled since early 2000s. And this has actually put a lot of pressure. So it's shifted the locus of law making or law creation to the dispute settlement system. And so it's actually put a lot of structural pressure on the dispute settlement mechanism to fill in the law and fill in gaps because the political bodies of the WTO aren't doing so. And you actually, when you talk to appellate body members or former appellate body members or members of the appellate body secretary, they feel this pressure. They're basically being asked to fill in gaps because the members can't sort of agree on anything to actually clarify rules in a meaningful way. So reform needs to be undertaken, but there's deadlock, right, among the members themselves, and so the locus of that pressure is now being shifted to the dispute settlement mechanism.
That's solving the deadlock problem. It's not pretty.
Yeah, it's not pretty, and it's putting a lot of pressure, right? It's putting a lot of pressure on these adjudicators to try to manage this balance, right? I guess it's an interesting counterfactual to think if the governments could actually engage in much quicker, more effective recontracting, right? If they could actually come to consensus to reform aspects of the dispute settlement mechanism or create new trade rules, if it wasn't deadlocked, whether or not the DSM would be sort of as accommodating or not, or even more accommodating. It's interesting, that's actually an interesting sort of way to think about that counterfactual. Like, would they be more accommodating if they knew that sort of reform was actually really easy to get through the political membership? I'm not sure. So I think for now, that tension is being managed between sort of these political pressures, but also sort of filling in gaps in trade law where it's needed. I think that's changing a little bit with the new administration in the U.S. in particular, and this has always been an issue, and I didn't talk very much about the appellate body. The appointment of the appellate body members has always been an incredibly politicized issue, with the U.S. holding up appointments, or basically vetoing appointments, for example, of a sort of opinion citizen who was up for appointment to a WTO appellate body a few years ago. And now, the Trump administration is basically blocking new appointments to the appellate body, which is sort of putting a workload strain on the appellate body. So I'll actually be in Geneva in a couple of weeks to do some follow-up interviews. So it'll be interesting to see what the mood is there. I think in terms of how of reforms that I would make to make it work more efficiently, or effectively, I actually really believe that this feedback mechanism is the appropriate way in which the dispute settlement mechanism should be, the judicial body for the WTO should be balancing, right, member concerns with sort of ensuring consistency and predictability with the application of WTO rules, right? Some deference, some leeway, some flexibility needs to be given to governments in how to implement these WTO rules in areas that implicate, for example, the environment, or public health and safety. These are areas that sort of really go to the heart of regulatory concerns of domestic governments, and there needs to be some flexibility there. And so to actually institutionalize a more formal feedback mechanism from the member governments and sort of how they see the dispute settlement mechanism, enabling them to exercise that sort of flexibility in these really sensitive regulatory areas, I think would improve the functioning of the dispute panels.
It institutionalize something that's already there, essentially.
Yes, but make it much more formalized and consistent across panel rulings, because for a very long time you had very inconsistent panel rulings, depending on whether the panelists were, repeat panelists, whether they bought into the whole system, or whether they sort of were much more reliant on the legal secretariat. Yeah, cool.
And going back to the capital political, I'm just curious if you noticed a trend if the criticism acted more as almost like a rumple strip on the side of the road that just made sure they didn't oversteer and they stayed straight in their lane, or did you see a trend over time where it was waxing and waning with political legitimacy of WTO more broadly? If it was the more limited, just make sure the dispute body or mechanism keeps to its more, just keeping it on its straight and narrow, or if it was tied more to legitimacy of the institution?
Yeah, I think on average and over time, it really is acting more as that rumble strip, right? So you don't see, when you see sharp spikes in criticism, you do see relatively more accommodation, but it's not massive, right? So it really is just like, let's just adjust at the margins a little bit. Let's give you that little spoonful of sugar to let the bad medicine go down more easily, so to speak. I think there are a couple pretty sort of well-documented instances where you do see incredibly sort of sharp criticisms to the legitimacy of the DSM as a whole, affecting pretty profound change in terms of its judicial decision-making. And the example that's put up there the most is when the appellate body and the panel started accepting these amicus curiae. So this happened in a number of disputes that sort of implicated environmental concerns. There was a case that involved sort of trade regulations that impacted sort of the safety of sea turtles, right? And all these environmental rights groups and NGOs and corporations actually wanted to submit these amicus curiae, basically argue their own legal arguments. And there was a huge outcry by the membership as a whole, like powerful countries, the countries that never really appeared before the DSM, that this was overstepping the boundaries. That the judges were overstepping the boundaries in this case, that this was supposed to be a member-driven system. This is a mantra that's like repeated, like this is a member-driven system, right? The DSM there is in the service of the WTO members, the governments. And by accepting this outside information, that the judges really overstepped. So there was sharp criticism. I mean, they had special meetings and to their credit, the appellate body and the appellate body secretariat said, okay, we hear you, but we're not responding in any way to this. So formally they said, look, we're not taking your concerns into account. The way they actually addressed this sort of real challenge to their legitimacy was by saying, okay, we'll accept these, but then in the decision they'll say, so we accepted these briefs, but we didn't take them into account. So it was sort of saying, we can do this. We can sort of take into account these extrinsic considerations, but we didn't in this case. And so trying to sort of walk that thin line of, okay, we recognize that you think we've overstepped our boundaries, we maintain the right to do so, but we'll give you this little bit of like assurance that this isn't actually impacting at the end of the day the adjudication of your dispute. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Lena Anterko. I'm a grad student in political science. Thanks for your talk.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if the picture you painted is maybe very pessimistic in terms of like reform going forward, because if you know, more accommodation slash deference equals more reform, but at the same time the like temporal trend is more appellate case law, which equals less reform or less accommodation, then I'm wondering, you know, if the trend will be over time just less and less reform, less accommodation, and you know what kind of link that would have to the crisis between developed and developing countries in terms of the developing world feeling less and less enfranchised, and their possibility of being accommodated in these disputes decreasing, or having the possibility of decreasing.
Yeah. So, so I definitely think that, so I think a couple of things. First of all, you know, it is a pretty pessimistic picture, at least if normatively what we want is these disputes out of bodies, right, to actually be responsive to these concerns. If they're paying less attention, right, to their underlying, to their sort of, the amount of support that they enjoy, as appellate body case law increases, then they're less responsive, they're providing less flexibility. And this might be problematic, right, if sort of the way in which the appellate body has decided a certain issue, right, is not satisfactory to the membership as a whole moving forward, or if sort of it becomes less satisfactory over time, which is possible. I think though, like in terms of actually where all that appellate body case law is, it's less problematic, or at least there's sort of less room for pessimism, at least the way that it stands now. So a lot of the disputes that are brought to the WTO to date have been about anti-dumping investigations, how anti-dumping investigations have been conducted, and about national treatment under the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And there's pretty already, and from sort of the GATT days, there's pretty well settled jurisprudence about how these things should be happening. So there's not a lot of controversy or disagreement among the membership as a whole about how some of these anti-dumping investigations should be conducted, or sort of what national treatment and trade discrimination looks like in certain areas. I think, though, there's much more disagreement about areas within WTO law that have been less litigated. We've seen fewer disputes arise over. So actually, and those are the areas that I think the developing countries in particular are much more likely to be concerned with. So rules or provisions having to do with the agreement on textiles and clothing, for example, where a number of developing countries have very strong vested interests in sort of protecting the textile industry. So the agreement on agriculture, for instance. A number of the exceptions within GATT that are provided for sort of ensuring public health and safety and sort of ensuring or enacting environmental or other regulatory goals domestically. These are areas that developing countries are likely to have a strong interest in seeing the DSM be responsive to membership concerns. So I think that though one pessimistic or problematic aspect of this trend might be with respect to the fact that as the dispute settlement mechanism as a whole becomes much less responsive to, or becomes more responsive to, and this is a key finding that I made, was that the DSM isn't being responsive to just the US and just the EU criticism and concern. It's really they care about sort of the membership, the secretariat officials in particular care about sort of the overarching amount of support enjoyed by the membership as a whole, including developing countries. Developing countries are now becoming increasingly frustrated with both how developed and powerful countries like the US and the EU are actually not fully implementing the rulings that the WTO is issuing all of the time. And that's reflecting now in sort of increased criticism of the DSM as a whole, and actually being able to address developing country power dynamics within the WTO. So, I don't know. So, and sort of that's like a really unsatisfactory answer to a difficult question. You know, it is. I think there is room for pessimism moving forward, depending on sort of what happens with ongoing trade negotiations and reform more broadly within the WTO, and depending on, and this is sort of something that neither I nor the WTO's DSM have control over, depending on where disputes are brought. So countries could be strategic litigators and sort of start to litigate disputes under the much less frequently litigated provisions that are of more concern to developing countries that might not be so engaged in the dispute settlement system yet due to, due to sort of capacity constraints and financial resource constraints. And that they might sort of be the first movers and sort of set the jurisprudence in a way that's difficult to dislodge moving further down the line in a way that could be ultimately detrimental to the least developed countries within the WTO. So yeah, maybe I painted more of an optimistic picture than I should be. Yeah, in the back.
I look at your work primarily through the lens of global governance, and I was thinking that perhaps what you are investigating is actually alluding to the disaggregation political authority under conditions of globalization. And based on that, thinking, I wanted to ask the following question, which is more of a clarified question than I will ask my basic question. Is it the case that in instances where the appellate jurisprudence increases, so it argues particular cases, so when that happens, is it also the case that the criticism also diminishes? And the reason I'm asking this question is that if indeed we can say that it is a particular type of cases where the jurisprudence is more important, is stronger towards political interest, then perhaps we could be talking about the legalization of political authority at the global level.
Sorry, what was the last phrase?
So, which one? What did you say?
The something of political authority.
Okay, so maybe could we make a hypothesis then that what we are capturing is also showing that there is a trend towards legalization of political authority at the global level, right? Because, as you said, these bodies like the WTO, they also take a lot of advice from non-governmental organizations.
Well, they accept
Yeah.
whether they actually take it into account. They say they don't.
So,
Yeah.
so we have many actors
Yeah.
participating, and what comes out of that exchange of information could be diminishing the political authority of states just because there is an established legal precedent.
Yeah.
As I suppose is the case with the overflowing of administrative law at the global level.
Yeah.
So maybe a similar phenomenon.
Yeah, because it's depoliticizing it because it just becomes more route or mundane or routine in some respect and almost sort of gets removed from the messy sort of political decisions that have to be made about things like.
Unintentionally,
Yeah.
but perhaps this is a trend.
Yeah, so I mean, I think to answer your questions quickly, yes and no. I think to some extent you do see that happening, this depoliticization of these issues where there is a lot of appellate body jurisprudence. You don't see a lot of criticism now about sort of the national treatment analysis that the panels of the appellate body do with a given provision. It's oftentimes in the new areas, the new provisions, the new areas of WTO law that haven't yet reached the dispute settlement system to that point, where you see a lot more countries chiming in. That being said, that's actually not necessarily captured in my measures of criticism and support. Because countries aren't only talking about, when they're talking about or signaling dissatisfaction or satisfaction with the exercise of judicial authority by the DSM, they're not only talking about individual decisions or the legal analysis within individual rulings or reports. They're talking more broadly about how, over a number of cases, or sort of procedurally, how the WTO's judges and the judicial bodies are exercising their authority. Whether or not they're providing, for instance, sort of due process rights between the parties. Whether or not they're taking into consideration sort of broader concerns about how the trade regime should be balanced against sort of environmental concerns, that sort of thing. So there is, I think, an extent to which for these really kind of boring, very sexy areas of trade law, that it has become depoliticized. But then sometimes you will see repoliticization of, and reassertion of political authority by domestic governments in some of these still highly litigated areas. And the most notable example is how the U.S. Department of Commerce in its anti-dumping investigation uses what's called sort of a zeroing method of determining duties, and I won't get into this, a way of calculating sort of how large anti-dumping duties you should impose on imports. And consistently, right, the appellate body and the panel has said zeroing methodology violates WTO rules. You have to get rid of this way of conducting an anti-dumping investigation, and this is so frequently litigated, right? And the U.S., adopts the panel report and says, okay, we're not going to implement this, and criticizes the decision-making by the panels and by the appellate body. So you do see some individual criticism, but what I hope that I'm capturing with these aggregate scores isn't that individual complaining and criticism or depoliticization necessarily, but a sort of an overall general level of sentiment, dissatisfaction or dissatisfaction with how, on average, right, the DSM is exercising its judicial authority. So to answer your question, yes and no. Yeah.
Results. Should we think of political capital as a variable that really reflects short-term variation? It has for 23 years, but that's a fairly short period.
Yep.
Maybe what we're seeing is that enough capital, political capital is accumulating that 40, 50 years from now, momentary criticism is like a drop in the bucket, and the political capital is accumulating. Maybe that's what we're seeing in the declining sensitivity, that you just get more and more oomph, and then each year's new criticism, it might be that the weight of political capital that's already accumulated just gets so great, it's less sensitive to short-term variation.
So I think that's definitely true, and I think with sort of the moderating influence of appellate body case law, we do see that. I mean, I'm sort of limited by the fact that the WTO has been around for that long, and so maybe this is really sort of just short-term responsiveness and variation that I'm capturing. But I think that still tells us something interesting about how it is that newly created international institutions or international judicial bodies sort of build up, I guess, their institutional authority, or how they build up in the short term, perhaps, their institutional authority in a way that's effective or not. There are some international judicial bodies that have been much less responsive to increased criticism and now face much stronger backlash and recontracting by states parties. The Inter-American Court of Human Rights and the European Court of Human Rights are good examples of this, where they've been much less sensitive, the Inter-American Court more than the European Court, but much less sensitive to sort of shifts in underlying dissatisfaction with how they're actually issuing their rulings. And so, even though that was sort of short-term for the Inter-American Court, picking up short-term variation, it led eventually to sort of severe backlash by a number of governments pulling out or threatening to pull out of the Inter-American human rights system. So I do think, like, what I am capturing by necessity empirically is sort of really just this short-term phenomenon, but I think it tells us an interesting story about how institutions, when they're created, sort of respond to or adapt to sort of their underlying political environment.
Go ahead. I'll have time to talk here afterward.
Everybody else can wait, so please go ahead.
Okay, you can take these as comments if you want. We're running a long time, so. A couple of things. One is you're assuming that the criticism from states is independent of the kind of underlying law and the extent to which the panels are adhering to it. So isn't it possible that when panels are straying a little bit more than they should, states are criticizing that, and then what we're observing after the fact is just the kind of pendulum swinging back that maybe the panels would have conducted anyway. So maybe the states aren't just being political, they're actually responding to deviations from the underlying law. And then in the DSB statements, do you have a way of knowing who made the statement, and have you done any more work with that? Because obviously we'd want to know whether criticisms from the United States or the EU have more influence than criticisms from Costa Rica. No offense to Costa Rica.
Costa Rica doesn't actually talk that much, so Cuba talks a lot.
It's feel free to accumulate
Yeah.
questions since we only have
Yeah, so I'm happy to talk to you more afterwards about both these things. And I've done individual classifications of these as well, and then put in sort of independent measures of US criticism and EU criticism. And I have articles in law journals that sort of map how the criticism and support varies across different groups of countries that I'm happy to send to you. Yes? Yes?
Yeah. Thanks for the fascinating talk. I'm Iki Yoshimoto. I'm a student in political science. I wonder if my understanding is correct. I wonder how, so the definition of accommodation was according the ruling. And I wonder how varied the issues are in how obvious these issues are in violation of the WTO rulings, because I guess that the complainants might be very confident in bringing up these issues. So that might not be a problem, but the obviousness might also correlate with the accumulation of case laws. So if maybe I missed some control variables that are controlled for that.
Yeah, so the argument would be, so maybe it's actually the complainant and the sort of the challenges that they're bringing that's driving all this accommodation, right? Because if they're just sort of bringing complaints against every single aspect of a trade measure, that's a lot more sort of room that the panel has to provide some accommodation versus others. And this is definitely a concern that I have, especially over time as complainants have started to basically challenge every single aspect of a trade measure they can. It's often called like kitchen sink disputes, right? They'll challenge every single part that they can, knowing that they have some losing arguments or losing claims in there. That being said, I think that's mitigated a little bit by the fact that before it even gets to the point of a dispute panel, there's a lot of bilateral negotiation and legal clarification that's going on between the complainants and the defendants. So the complainants have a much better sense after this which of their claims have a stronger legal case, and this kind of gets to Alex, to your first question as well, which of their claims have a stronger legal case and which don't. And it's costly, like to bring a trade dispute, so maybe it doesn't matter so much for the EU and the US, but to bring a trade dispute is incredibly costly. So countries aren't going to waste, their governments aren't going to necessarily always waste their time on litigating claims that they have very little chance of winning, or over which there's very little legal disagreement about what the law actually says. So these are actually claims that they're bringing. They think, right, that there's legitimate disagreement between the parties about how this should apply to this given instance, how this law should apply to this given instance. I don't think that fully addresses the concern, because especially now that you do see this kitchen sink type litigation where they're sort of, let's like bombard the panel, and that gives the panel an opportunity to provide more deference and accommodation in sort of the low-hanging fruit areas, right? The areas where it doesn't really matter so much if it's found in violation or not. It's a really weak claim that the party, sort of thrown-on claim that the party brought, that allows the panel to still sort of signal more deference, but in a way that perhaps isn't as meaningful as I want it to be, I want accommodation to be. So I have some measures, and sort of in further, as I'm developing more book manuscript, I've started to break this out to try to actually capture, like, when is a finding really important, and does it really get to the heart of the trade policy, and when is it sort of this add-on sort of finding that is really low-hanging fruit for the panel? Yep. Yeah.
Let's make this the last question.
I'm Denise Marswati. I'm a grad student also in political science. This might be kind of a dumb question, so forgive me if it's obvious. This is not anything related to what I do, but I'm still kind of stuck on this idea of political capital. So I can understand why panelists would be motivated by political capital in the sense that if they have more of it, they could be assigned to more panels. But if they're being assigned by the Director General, is the Director General also sensitive to these criticisms that are happening, or the criticism that's happening within the sort of the complaint system, the statement-making system? And does he or she take that into account when he's making these panel assignments? Because if that's the case, then I could see why panelists would care. But if that person is not considering these statements, then how does the political capital actually factor into their motivations for wanting to be more accommodative so that they don't get as much criticism. And then the second part of the political capital question is, if you have a situation where political capital and compliance with the panel decisions are very tightly coupled, then it makes sense to me that panelists would want to make sure that they're kind of following the mood of the members, and so they're going to want to issue decisions where they will be more accommodating so that they can get more compliance down the road because members are happier. But if those two things aren't linked, and it sounds like they might not be totally linked, because you have the U.S. refusing to comply with things, which may or may not be linked to how happy they are with the WTO, then what is the motivation in this story then for panelists to care about how member states are talking about the WTO? If the criticism is not linked to actual compliance and their prospects for being reassigned to panels is not linked to the Director General caring about criticism, then how does the political capital work in that case?
So, I don't know if I can do this in reverse order. So, I should say actually the vast majority of disputes that are brought before the WTO and that are ruled on are settled in some way or the other. Whether that's through, this is a completely different conversation, whether that's through actually full implementation in compliance with the ruling, or whether after the ruling is issued, the countries start negotiating again and come to some resolution of the dispute. So in the Indonesia-US case, right, the US still has this law in place. We still ban the sale of clove cigarettes, but menthols are fine. But this dispute is considered resolved because the US basically paid off Indonesia to say, okay, let's resolve this dispute. So then that doesn't really matter so much for political capital. But in the vast majority of cases, right, these disputes are being resolved. And panels, and the secretariat officials in particular, do see this form of accommodation as making it easier for governments to go home and implement these rulings. So the Chinese representative said this actually helps us when we have to go back home and reform our trade laws. When they give us that little bit more of accommodation, it makes it much easier for us. It matters more, I show in other research, for when it has to go through legislative reform than when it can be done entirely through administrative reform. But it is coupled slightly with better compliance with these rulings. On the WTO Director General, who does appoint sort of almost 2/3 of these panelists, I think it varies the extent, and I think the Director Generals are also secretariat officials, and so they're invested in seeing the success of the WTO organization as a whole, and dispute settlement mechanism now in particular. And so they are paying attention to sort of shifts in mood among the membership as a whole. I think the extent to which they do so has varied across the different Director Generals, and the current one is sort of, I think, a little bit less sensitive to criticism coming from some countries than the former Director General was. But I do think that and it's really opaque how the Director General decides which panelists to appoint. But from talking to panelists who have been appointed and not appointed by given Director Generals, my sense is that the Director General is always looking to appoint panelists who both parties will be happy with. So individuals that are attuned to the more general sort of mood of the WTO, but that isn't sort of biased in one direction or another for any of the parties to dispute. It's probably not a satisfactory answer to the question. We can talk more after the fact, but I want to let you guys go. So thank you so much for all of your comments.